My name is Mireille Castellane. I am 29 years old. I was diagnosed as autistic at age 9, after 2 years of my parents telling teachers and relatives and each other that I was simply difficult, simply sensitive, simply not like my brother. I have spent 20 years inside a family hospitality company built by my great-grandmother, watching my parents build an entire mythology around my younger brother Theo's charm and explain away my existence as a complication to be managed. 6 weeks ago, at the opening gala for the 7th Castellane House restaurant, in front of 240 guests, a notary I had never met handed me a sealed envelope and said that my great-grandmother had asked him to deliver it the day my father made his intentions clear in public, and that he believed he just had. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Adeline Castellane, dead for 11 years, had been documenting their treatment of me since I was 7 years old. She had been building something this entire time. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and what happened over the following 72 hours, and what I said in a boardroom that smelled like garlic and rosemary because it used to be a private dining room before the company outgrew it, I need to take you back to where this actually starts. Not 6 weeks ago, 60 years ago, to a woman who opened a single bistro in New Orleans with money she earned doing other people's laundry. If you're new here, welcome to Stillwater's Drama. Please subscribe and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every one. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Adeline Castellane opened Maison Castellane on Magazine Street in New Orleans in 1964. She was 26 years old, a widow with 2 small children, and exactly $412 to her name, which she had saved doing other families' laundry and ironing for 3 years. She cooked everything herself for the first 18 months. She slept 4 hours a night. She built a regular clientele, one satisfied table at a time, and by 1970 she had paid off the building and bought the lot next door. By the time she died in 2013, at age 75, the Castellane Hospitality Group operated 6 restaurants across 3 states, a catering division, and a culinary apprenticeship program she had, personally funded for 22 years, training young cooks who could not otherwise afford culinary school. The company was valued at the time of her death at $31 million. She built every dollar of it from 412. I never knew her as a businesswoman. I knew her as Mamie Adeline, who let me sit in the corner booth of the original Magazine Street location every Sunday afternoon while she did the week's ordering, who never once asked me to make eye contact with her or to stop lining up the sugar packets in size order on the table, who simply let me be exactly the shape I was without narrating it as a problem. She died when I was 18. I'm going to tell you about the last conversation we had because it explains everything that came after, even though I did not understand what she meant for 11 more years. I was diagnosed autistic at 9, after 2 years of meltdowns at school that nobody could explain, and a fixation on restaurant inventory systems that nobody understood, and a tendency to tell the truth in rooms where the truth was not wanted. My mother, Camille, took me to 4 different specialists before one of them used the word my parents had apparently been avoiding. Camille cried in the car afterward, not from relief, from something closer to grief, as though a diagnosis had taken something from her, rather than explain something to her. My father, Etienne, Adeline's grandson, and by then the company's CEO, handled it differently. He treated the diagnosis like a liability that needed quiet management. He did not tell extended family for 2 years. When he eventually did, he framed it carefully, in the language he used for everything. Mireille has some particular ways about her. He would say, the way you would describe a difficult vendor, relationship, particular, sensitive, a lot to manage. I want to be precise about what my childhood actually felt like, because the word autism gets used by people who have never had to live inside the specific arithmetic of being managed rather than known. I was not unhappy because I was autistic. I was unhappy because the adults around me treated my autism as something to apologize for on my behalf, a standing apology issued at every family gathering before I had even said a word. My brother Theo is 2 years younger than me. He is, by every external measure, easy. He is warm in restaurants the way my great-grandmother was warm in restaurants, remembers names, tells stories with good timing, makes people feel specifically seen. My parents adored this about him from the time he could talk. I do not blame Theo for being adored. I want to say that clearly before I say anything else, because this is not a story about a villain's sibling. Theo is, in his own complicated way, a victim of the same system that hurt me. He was simply positioned on the side of it that looked from the outside, like winning. My parents built the family mythology around two poles. Theo, the natural, the one who would inherit the warmth that made Castellane House special. And me, the complication, the one who needed accommodations and explanations and the careful management of expectations. I learned to read inventory sheets before I learned to read most novels. I found numbers calming in a way that conversation rarely was. By 12, I had memorized the full supply chain structure of the original Magazine Street kitchen, not because anyone taught me, but because patterns were the thing my mind reached for naturally, the way some children reach for music or drawing. My great-grandmother noticed this when I was 13. She sat me down at her kitchen table with a stack of old purchase orders from 1987 and said, "Tell me what you see." I told her. I told her about a vendor who had been overcharging by small, inconsistent amounts for 11 months. Amounts small enough that no one looking at any single invoice would notice, but visible the moment you laid 11 months of invoices side by side. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You found that in 20 minutes. It took me 3 years to catch him doing it the first time." I said, "It was just sitting there, Mamie." She said, "Most people can't see what's sitting there, Mireille. That is not a flaw. That is the rarest gift in this business." I did not fully understand what she meant. I would not for 16 more years. My parents' approach to me hardened as I got older, not because I changed, but because the company grew and the stakes of who would eventually run it grew with it. By the time I was in my 20s, the family's operating assumption, spoken and unspoken, was that Theo would eventually take over Castellane Hospitality Group, and that I would occupy some peripheral role suited to my particular ways, language my mother still used without apparent awareness of how it landed. I graduated from Tulane with a degree in accounting, top of my program, because numbers were the one place I never had to perform anything. I joined the company at 23 as a financial analyst, a role 2 levels below where my credentials should have placed me in a department that reported up through 3 layers of management. Before reaching my father, none of whom were instructed to consult me on anything beyond my immediate function. Theo joined the same year, directly into a director-level operations role, despite a business degree he had finished in 5 years with a GPA that would have embarrassed most of the line cooks he was. Now meant to supervise. I'm not bitter about Theo's GPA. I'm telling you this because it matters for what comes later, when the language around competence gets used very selectively in my family, and I want you to understand the actual record before anyone starts narrating it differently. I want to tell you about one specific incident because it is the one I return to most when I try to explain what those years were like. In my second year at the company, I identified an inventory discrepancy at the 4th Castellane House location in Baton Rouge, similar in shape to the one I had found in my great-grandmother's old invoice a decade earlier, a vendor relationship that had been quietly siphoning roughly $11,000 a month for over a year, hidden inside rounding patterns that no single monthly report would reveal. I documented it carefully. I built a spreadsheet that laid out 14 months of invoices side by side, exactly the way Mamie Adeline had taught me to look, with the discrepancy highlighted in a column I labeled plainly unexplained variance. I brought it to my direct supervisor, a man named Philip Doucette, who had been with the company 11 years and reported to my father. Philip looked at the spreadsheet for 4 minutes. Then he said, "This is good work, Mireille. Let me take it from here." I said, "I'd like to present the findings myself. I think the board should hear it directly from the analyst who found it." He said, not unkindly, but with the particular tone people use when they have already decided something, "It's probably easier if I present it. You know how presentations can be for you?" I did not fight him on it, because fighting required a kind of social calculation I had spent my whole life being told I was bad at, and because I had already absorbed, by 24, the lesson that Pushing back on these moments cost more than it returned. 3 weeks later, at the quarterly board meeting, Philip Doucette presented the vendor discrepancy as his own discovery. My name appeared nowhere in the materials. My father in the room praised Philip's diligence. Philip received a bonus that quarter that, I would learn later, exceeded my entire annual salary at the time. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table and did not cry, because crying was not a thing my body did easily, but I sat very still for a long time, the way I do when something has happened that I need to process slowly, in layers, the way you'd work through a long column of figures. I never told anyone what had happened. I want to be honest about that. I absorbed it the way I had absorbed most things in that company. Quietly, filed away, documented in my own private record, the spreadsheets and notes I kept on my personal laptop. Not because I had a plan, but because documenting things was simply how my mind organized the world. It would turn out that I was not the only person in my family who had been keeping records. Theo's wedding was 18 months ago. I'm mentioning it because it is the clearest single illustration I can give you of how my family had organized itself around the two of us. By then, the wedding was held at the flagship Castellane House location, the one on Magazine Street, my great-grandmother's original restaurant, fully renovated now into the company's crown jewel, 300 guests. My father gave a toast that ran 11 minutes by the kitchen timer I was tracking on my phone because I find structured time grounding during long social events. He talked about Theo's natural leadership. He talked about Theo's future as the company's next CEO, a title that had not, as far as I knew, been formally voted on by the board, but which my father announced that night as though it were settled. Fact. He mentioned me once. He said, and of course, Mireille has always kept the numbers honest for us. We're grateful for that. A small, polite laugh moved through some of the tables. I understood, even then, what the laugh was responding to. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more like the comfortable shorthand of people who have decided collectively what a person is for, and find it mildly charming to have that confirmed in public. I did not laugh. I sat very still in my seat and counted the chandelier crystals above the head table, which is a thing I do when a room becomes too much, and waited for the toast to end. After the reception, in the parking lot, my mother found me before I could leave. She said, "You looked uncomfortable in there tonight." I said, "I was fine, Mom." She said, "You know your father loves you. He just doesn't always know how to say things the way you'd want him to." I said, "I know how he says things, Mom. I've been listening my whole life." She did not have a response to that. She hugged me, briefly. The careful, slightly tentative hug she had given me since I was a child, the hug of someone managing contact rather than offering it, and then she went back inside to the reception, and I drove home. I did not know, that night, that my great-grandmother had been dead for 5 years already, and had still found a way to be paying closer attention than my own parents. I need to tell you about the last conversation I had with Mamie Adeline, because I have replayed it more times than I can count since the night everything changed, and it took me 11 years to understand it fully. I was 18. She was 75, 6 weeks from her death, though none of us knew the timeline yet. She had asked me to come to her apartment above the original restaurant, the same apartment she had lived in since 1965, and we sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once handed me a stack of 1987 invoices. She said, "I want to talk to you about the company." I said, "I'm only 18, Mamie. I don't think I'm supposed to be talking about the company yet." She said, "That's exactly why I need to talk to you now, before everyone else decides what you are." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands which had cooked for 50 years and built an empire, and were now beginning to shake slightly with a tremor she had not yet told the family about. She said, "I have watched your father and your mother organize this family around your brother since the day he was born. I am not telling you this to turn you against them. They love you both, but they have made a decision, without ever saying it out loud, about which of you is the future of this company and which of you is the thing that needs managing." I said, "I know, Mamie." She said, "You see things, Mireille. You see them faster and clearer than anyone I have worked with in 60 years, including myself at your age." I built this company by paying attention to things other people walked past without noticing. You do that better than I ever did. And your family has decided that your way of paying attention is a defect instead of the single rarest skill in this entire industry. I did not say anything. I was 18 and I did not yet have language for how much that observation would matter to me later. She said, I am not going to fight your father about this while I am alive. He is my grandson and I love him, and this is, in the end, his company to run while he's living. And I have made my peace with that. But I am not going to let his blind spots be the last word on who you are. Not after I'm gone. She reached across the table and took my hand, briefly the way she always did, light and quick, because she had learned that I needed contact offered in a form I could actually receive. She said, when the time comes, and you'll know when it comes because it will not be subtle, there's a man named Desmond Achebe. He's my attorney. He has instructions. You don't need to do anything right now, except remember his name. I said, Desmond Achebe. She said, good, now eat something. You've been sitting here for 40 minutes and you haven't touched your gumbo. She died 6 weeks later. I did not think about Desmond Achebe again for 11 years, not because I forgot the name. My memory for specific information of that kind does not work that way, but because nothing in those 11 years told me it was time, until the gala. The 7th Castellane House opened in Houston 6 weeks ago. It was, by every metric the company tracked, the most ambitious launch in its history. 240 guests, a 4-course tasting menu, a wine list my father had spent 8 months curating personally, local press, 2 James Beard Award judges, 3 city council members, and the entire extended Castellane family, all present in a room designed the way all of my father's rooms were designed to be a stage for a story he wanted told about himself. I had worked on the financial modeling for that location for 14 months. I had built the supply chain projections, identified 2 vendor relationships that would have repeated the Baton Rouge pattern if left unexamined, and restructured the location's labor cost model in a way that, by my own calculations, would save the company approximately $400,000 annually once fully implemented. None of that work appeared anywhere in the gala program. The program listed Theo Castellane as the visionary behind Castellane House Houston. It listed our father as the company's legendary leader. It did not list me at all, in any capacity, despite my name appearing on every financial document underlying the project for over a year. I noticed this when I picked up the program at the registration table. I did not make a scene. I'm not a person who makes scenes, partly by temperament and partly because 30 years of being told my reactions were too much had trained me, long before I had the language to question whether that training was fair, to keep most of what I felt very carefully contained. I found my seat. Table 14, near the kitchen entrance, with 2 cousins I saw twice a year and a vendor representative I did not know. Not the family table at the front, which seated my parents, Theo, his wife, and several board members. At 8:45, my father took the stage. He thanked the staff. He thanked the city of Houston. He talked for nearly 12 minutes about the legacy of Castellane House and the future he saw for it. Then he said, I want to take a moment to talk about that future specifically, because tonight isn't just about this restaurant. It's about where this company goes next. He gestured for Theo to join him on stage. Theo did, easily, comfortably, the way Theo did everything, and the room applauded before my father had even finished his sentence. My father said, effective at the start of next fiscal year, Theo Castellane will be stepping into the role of President and Chief Operating Officer of Castellane Hospitality Group with a clear and intentional path to the CEO position when I retire. This has been frankly the plan since the day this remarkable young man was born, and I could not be prouder to say it out loud tonight. The applause was immediate and sustained. I watched my mother dab at her eyes. I watched the board members at the front table nod along, several of them already aware. I would learn later of an arrangement that had apparently been discussed in rooms I had never been invited into. My father's eyes moved across the room, briefly, the practiced sweep of a man checking that his audience was fully with him, and landed for 1/2 second on table 14. On me. He did not say my name. He did not acknowledge in front of 240 guests that there was a second Castellane sibling in the room who had spent 14 months building the financial architecture, the very restaurant they were standing independent on. He simply moved past me, the way he had been moving past me for 20 years, and continued his speech. I sat at table 14 and did the thing I do when a room becomes too much to process in real time. I counted the panes of glass in the window behind the stage. 48. I counted them twice to be certain. That was when a man I had never seen before approached my table. He was perhaps 60, silver hair, a dark gray suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, and a leather portfolio under one arm. He did not approach loudly. He simply appeared at the edge of table 14 and said quietly, in a voice clearly calibrated not to carry, "Miss Castellane?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Desmond Achibi. I was your great-grandmother's attorney." The name landed the way a specific, long-stored piece of information lands when it is finally retrieved and matched against present circumstances, exact and immediate, with no fog around the edges. I said, "I remember your name. She told me about you 11 years ago." Something in his expression shifted slightly. A small recalibration of his own expectations. He said, "She told me you would." She was very specific that you would remember exactly, word for word, the conversation in which she gave you my name. She said it was one of the things she trusted most about you. He set the portfolio on the table and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored, heavy stock, with a wax seal stamped with the initials AC. He said, "Adeline asked me to deliver this to you under one specific condition." She said, "Deliver it on the day Etienne makes his intentions for the company's future clear in public in a way that leaves no room for interpretation." I believe what just happened on that stage qualifies. I looked at the envelope. I said, "What's in it?" He said, "I don't know the full contents." She wrote the letter herself and sealed it before giving it to me. "What I do know is the legal instrument it references, because I drafted that myself on her instructions 4 years before she died." I said, "I need a minute." He said, "Take whatever time you need. I'll be near the bar. There is no urgency tonight beyond what's written inside. The actual clock doesn't start until you open it." He withdrew. I sat at table 14, the applause for Theo still rolling in waves toward the stage, and I held the envelope very still in both hands, the way I hold things when I need a few seconds before my body and mind agree on what happens next. Then I excused myself, walked through the kitchen entrance, the one closest to my table, found a quiet hallway near the walk in coolers that smelled like rosemary and cold steel, and opened it. The envelope held 2 things: a letter in my great-grandmother's handwriting and a second, smaller envelope containing a formal legal document. I read the letter first. She wrote, "My dearest Mireille, if you're reading this, it means Desmond has done exactly what I asked, and your father has done exactly what I feared he eventually would. I'm sorry I'm not there to be in the room with you tonight. Whatever room it turns out to be, I have imagined it many times over the years, and I never once imagined it being easy for you." She wrote, "I have watched this family, even from a great distance, for longer than you know. I built mechanisms, before I died, for staying informed about how this company and this family were being run after I was gone. I'm not proud of needing to do that. I would have preferred to trust my own grandson fully. But I have learned things over 60 years in this business, and one of them is that trust without verification is simply hope wearing a disguise, and hope does not protect the people who need protecting." She wrote, "I have watched, through reports I commissioned from people loyal to me rather than to Etienne, the way this family has treated you. The Baton Rouge discrepancy, which you found and were never credited for. The board meetings you were excluded from despite work that depended entirely on your analysis. The toast at Theo's wedding. I know about all of it, Mireille, because I made sure I would." I had to stop reading for a moment, standing in that hallway near the walk-in coolers, because something in my chest had become very full very quickly. in the specific way that happens to me when an ace emotion arrives faster than my body has processed structure to handle it. I read on. She wrote, I'm not telling you this to make you angry at your father, though you have every right to feel whatever you feel. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that you are not invisible. Not to me. I saw every single thing they walked past without noticing, the way you have always seen things other people walk past without noticing. That is not a coincidence. That is the same gift, working in both directions. She wrote, 4 years before I died, I restructured a portion of my personal holding company, separate entirely from the operating company your father runs, into a trust. This trust holds the original real estate underlying 3 of our 7 locations, including the Magazine Street flagship, along with 41% of the voting shares in Castellane Hospitality, group that I personally retained and never transferred to your father upon his appointment as CEO. He believes that share was distributed as part of the standard succession plan in 2013. It was not. It has been held separately by this trust for 11 years. I had to read that paragraph twice. I read it a third time to be certain I had the structure correct, because precision matters to me in moments like this more than almost anything else does. 41% held separately for 11 years. She wrote, the trustee of this document is Desmond Heb. The beneficiary upon a triggering event I will describe below is you, Mireille, and you alone. I did not split this between you and Theo, and I want to explain why. Because I think you, of anyone in this family, will understand the reasoning rather than simply receiving it as favoritism. She wrote, Theo will be fine. He has been given his whole life every advantage this family had to offer, and he will continue to receive them regardless of what I do here. You have been given something different. You have been given a family that loves you and consistently fails to see you, and a company that has profited repeatedly from your work without ever crediting it. This is not a reward for being wronged. It is a correction. There is a difference, and I trust you to know it. I leaned against the cold concrete wall of that hallway. I could hear faintly the gala continuing on the other side of the kitchen doors, the orchestra, the murmur of 240 conversations, none of which were about me. She wrote, the triggering event is this. Upon any public announcement by Etienne Castellane naming a successor to the CEO role that does not include formal acknowledgement of your role and standing within the company, equal in process, if not in outcome to whatever process was used to designate that successor, the trust converts. The 41% voting share transfers to you outright, along with the deeded real estate. You will need to formally request a board session to present this. Desmond has the document. You have 72 hours from the moment you receive this letter to initiate that request, or the trust reverts to its standing instructions, which I will not detail here, because I do not believe you will need them. 72 hours. She wrote, at the very end, I'm not asking you to destroy your father. I'm asking you to make sure this company, the one I built from $412 and 50 years of work, ends up in the hands of someone who actually sees what they are looking at. I have always believed that was you. I believe it now more than ever, watching, even from wherever I am, the room you just walked out of. She wrote, I love you exactly as you are, Mireille. I always have. I built this so that one day, the rest of them would have to see that too. On paper, where it cannot be managed away. All my love. Mamie Adeline. I stood in that hallway for what my phone later told me was 11 minutes. I did not cry. Not because I was not moved, profoundly moved, but because my body processes large emotional information slowly, in layers. The way I process most things, and the tears, when they eventually came, would come 3 days later, alone in my apartment, not in that hallway. What I felt standing there, more immediately than grief or vindication, was something closer to recognition. The specific settling feeling of a pattern finally completing itself after 11 years of holding an unfinished shape in the back of my mind, without knowing what it was waiting to become. Desmond Achebe was at the bar exactly where he said he would be. I found him. I said, I've read it. He said, I assumed as much. Are you all right? I said, I don't know yet. "I'll know in a few days," he said. "That's a reasonable answer." I said, "I need you to confirm something for me, the 72 hours. When did they start?" He said, "The moment you opened the envelope." Adeline was very specific about that. She said you would want exact parameters and that giving you anything less precise would be unkind. I said, she was right. He said, she usually was. I looked back toward the ballroom, where the gala continued, where my father was almost certainly still accepting congratulations, where Theo was almost certainly glowing in the specific warm light he had glowed in his entire life. I said, I'd like to schedule that board session. He said, I assumed you would. I have the document with me. We can begin tonight if you're ready. I said, I'm ready. I want to pause here because I know some of you are wondering, the way people have wondered about every protagonist in stories like this one. Why I didn't simply walk away. Why build a case instead of cutting the cord entirely? I have thought about this question more than almost any other in the 6 weeks since. Here's the most honest answer I have. I'm autistic. I do not experience most things the way the people around me experience them. And one of the things I have learned slowly over 29 years is that my version of attachment does not look like other people's version of attachment, but it is no less real for being different. I loved my great-grandmother with the specific, steady, undemonstrative love that is the only kind my nervous system tends to produce, and that love did not end when she died. It simply continued, quietly, in the background the way most things in my internal world continue quietly in the background until something calls them forward. She built something for me. Not money, though. There was money involved. She built proof that I had been seen accurately, by someone whose judgment I trusted completely. In a family that had spent 20 years training me to doubt whether I deserved to be seen at all. Walking away from that would have meant walking away from her too, and I was not willing to do that. So I did not walk away. I called Desmond Achebe. I scheduled the board session, and I went home that night and built a presentation. The way I build everything, methodically, in layers, check twice for accuracy, because that is the only way I know how to enter a room. I cannot afford to lose. If you've ever been the one in your family who saw everything and was credited for nothing, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and subscribe if you haven't, because what happened in that boardroom is the part I think about every day since. The board session was held 70 hours after I opened the envelope, 2 hours before the deadline, in the private dining room at the Magazine Street flagship that the company still used for formal board meetings, the same restaurant my great-grandmother had built from nothing. The room still smelling faintly even now of garlic and rosemary from decades of service before it became a meeting. Space. 9 board members. My father at the head of the table. Theo to his right present because he had recently been added to the board ahead of his formal promotion, a fact I noted with the specific clarity I note most facts. My mother was not on the board but had been invited at my father's request, presumably to manage me, the way she had been deployed to manage me my entire life. I sat at the far end of the table with Desmond Achebe beside me and a folder containing the trust documents, the letter, 14 months of financial modeling for the Houston location, and the original Baton Rouge spreadsheet from 5 years earlier, the one labeled plainly unexplained variance, which I had kept on my personal drive the entire time, the way I keep everything. My father said, before the meeting formally opened, Murray, I want to understand what this is about. Desmond says you've requested an emergency session regarding a trust document. I said, that's correct. He said, what trust document? I said, I'd like to let Mr. Achebe explain the legal structure, and then I'll walk the board through the underlying facts. My father looked at Desmond Achebe, recognition moving slowly across his face. The recognition of a man encountering a name he has not thought about in 11 years, and is only now realizing he probably should have. Desmond opened his portfolio. He explained the structure of the holding trust, the 41% voting share my great-grandmother had retained separately from the operating company, the real estate held in trust rather than transferred, and the triggering condition written into the document 4 years before her death. My father's face, over the course of those 6 minutes, moved through several distinct stages. Confusion, disbelief, something that by the time Desmond finished had settled into a kind of pale, careful stillness I had never seen on him before. He said, "When Desmond finished, this isn't possible. My mother transferred her full ownership stake to me in 2013. I have the documents." Desmond said, "You have documents transferring the operating company shares she held directly. You do not have documents for the 41% held inside this separate trust, because that trust was never part of the operating company transfer. It was structured, deliberately to remain outside your visibility." My father looked at me. He said, "She kept this from me. For 11 years. I said, "She kept it in reserve, Dad." "There's a difference," he said. "Reserve for what?" I said, "For exactly this." I opened my folder. I said, "I'd like the board to look at 3 things before we discuss the trust further." I laid out the Baton Rouge spreadsheet first. I explained, plainly, without performance, the discrepancy I had found 5 years earlier, the presentation I had been excluded from, and the bonus Philip Doucette had received for work that was, its entirety mine. Philip Doucette, I should note, was not in that room. He had left the company 2 years prior for a competitor. But 2 board members who had been present at that original meeting exchanged a look I recognized, the specific look of people recalculating a memory in real time. I laid out the Houston financial modeling second. 14 months of supply chain projections, the 2 vendor relationships I had flagged before they became another Baton Rouge, and the labor cost restructuring that would save the company by conservative estimate, $400,000 annually. I noted that my name appeared on every underlying document. I noted that my name had appeared nowhere in the gala program 6 days earlier. I laid out the third item last. A simple summary page, 1 sheet, listing every major financial discovery or structural improvement I had personally authored at Castellane Hospitality Group over 6 years, alongside the name of whoever had ultimately been credited for each one in board materials or public communications. 6 entries. 6 different names, none of them mine. The room was very quiet when I finished. My mother was looking at the tablecloth. Theo, to my genuine surprise, was looking directly at me, his expression unreadable in a way I could not immediately parse, which is unusual for me with my brother specifically, since I have spent 27 years learning to read him with reasonable accuracy. My father said, finally quietly, "I didn't know about all of this." I said, "I believe you didn't know about Baton Rouge specifically. I don't believe you didn't know that I was doing significant work that wasn't being credited. I believe you decided, somewhere along the way, that crediting it would complicate the story you wanted to tell about Theo's future, and it was easier not to look closely." He did not deny it. I want to note that because it mattered to me more than almost anything else said in that room. He did not deny it. A board member named Florence Achterberg, who had served with my great-grandmother for over a decade before my father's tenure, said, "Etienne, I think we need to discuss the trust on its own merits now, separately from how we got here." My father nodded slowly. He said to me, in a voice that had lost most of its boardroom authority, "What do you want, Mireille?" I had thought about this question for 70 hours by the time he asked it. I want to tell you honestly what I considered, because I think the considering matters as much as the answer. I considered requesting full removal. The trust, once converted, would have given me, combined with allied board votes I believed I could secure given Florence Achterberg's evident sympathy, and at least 2 other members I had quietly spoken with in the preceding 2 days, sufficient standing to force a leadership vote that could have ended my father's tenure as CEO entirely. I'm not going to pretend that thought did not occur to me, or that some part of me, the part that had sat through that wedding toast and that gala announcement, and 5 years of Baton Rouge silence, did not want exactly that. But my great-grandmother's letter had said something I kept returning to. "I'm not asking you to destroy your father. I'm asking you to make sure this company ends up in the hands of someone who actually sees what they are looking at." I did not think destroying my father accomplished that. I thought it accomplished something else, something closer to the thing my family had been doing to me for 20 years, just redirected. I said, "I'd like the trust to convert, as written. I'd like the 41% voting share transferred to me formally, on the record. My father nodded slowly, as though absorbing a blow he had already braced for. I said, "I'm not requesting your removal as CEO." Something moved across the table, a small collective recalibration. I said, "I'm requesting 3 things. First, that the board formally recognize, in writing, the work I have done over 6 years, including the Baton Rouge discrepancy and the Houston financial modeling, with appropriate compensation adjustment retroactive to when that work was performed, calculated by the board's own compensation committee, using the same standard applied to Philip Doucette's bonus structure that year. Second, that the succession plan for this company be formally reopened, not predetermined. I'm not asking for the CEO role to be handed to me the way it was being handed to Theo. I'm asking for an actual process. Qualifications reviewed, candidates considered on the merits of demonstrated work, not on the comfort of a story this family has been telling itself since before either of us could talk. Third, that I be appointed to this board formally as a voting member commensurate with my actual ownership stake, effective immediately. I looked around the table. I said, "My great-grandmother built this company by seeing things other people walked past without noticing. I am asking this board to do the same thing, just once, in this room today." The vote was not immediate. There was discussion, nearly 90 minutes of it. Much of it uncomfortable, some of it, from 2 board members loyal to my father, openly resistant. But Florence Ochterberg spoke at length about Adeline Castellane's original values for the company, the apprenticeship program she had funded for 22 years specifically to identify talent that conventional pathways overlooked, and the particular irony, she noted carefully, of that same company nearly overlooking its founder's own great-granddaughter. The board voted 7-2 in favor of all 3 requests. My father did not vote against me. I want to note that specifically because it surprised me. He abstained, which Desmond Achebe later told me was, in a man like my father, its own kind of admission. I want to tell you what happened after the vote, because the quiet aftermath matters as much as the boardroom did, maybe more. Theo found me in the hallway outside, the same hallway where I had once, years earlier, eaten lunch alone during a company event because no one had thought to invite me to the table where the rest of the family sat. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, in a posture I did not immediately recognize on him, because Theo's posture, his entire physical vocabulary, had always been built around ease. And this was not ease. He said, "I didn't know about Baton Rouge." I said, "I believe you." He said, "I didn't know about a lot of it, actually. I think I let myself believe the story Dad told, because it was the story where I was the hero of it, and that was easier than asking questions." I said, "That's an honest answer." He said, "I don't know what to do with this. The whole succession thing. I've spent my whole life thinking this was just going to be mine eventually." I said, "It still might be, Theo." I asked for a real process, not a guarantee for myself. If you're actually the right person for the role, the process will show that. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You really mean that?" I said, "I don't say things I don't mean." "You know that about me," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on it, in a way I had genuinely never heard from my brother before. "I'm sorry, Mireille, for the wedding, for never saying anything when Dad would talk past you, for just letting it all happen because it was working out for me. I did not say it's fine because it was not fine, and I have spent 29 years learning not to say things I do not mean simply to make a moment more comfortable for someone else." I said, "I appreciate you saying that. I think we have a lot of rebuilding to do, and I'm willing to do it. But it's going to take time, and it's going to require you actually changing how you show up, not just feeling bad in a hallway." "Once." He nodded. He said, "That's fair." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you carry all of this, all these years?" I don't think I could have. I thought about that question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. I said, "I didn't always carry it well. I carried it the way I carry everything, in layers, slowly, often alone, because that's how my mind processes things. And most of you never built the kind of space where I could process it any other way." But I carried it, and then Mamie Adeline made sure I wouldn't have to carry it forever without anyone else ever knowing the weight of it. He nodded again. He did not have a response to that, and I did not need him to. My mother approached me differently. 3 days later, over coffee, she requested at a shop near my apartment neutral ground. She said, I keep trying to understand how I missed it, how we missed it, for so long. I said, I don't think you missed it, Mom. I think you saw it and decided it was easier to manage than to address. She flinched visibly the way people do when an exact truth lands without the softening most conversations build in around it. I do not soften truths easily. It is not a skill my mind has ever prioritized acquiring. She said, that's harder to hear than I expected. I said, I know. I'm not saying it to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's accurate, and you asked. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I don't know how to be the mother you needed 20 years ago. I don't think I can go back and become that person retroactively. I said, you can't. Nobody can. But you can decide what kind of mother you're going to be from now forward, and that's the only part of this that's actually still available to either of us. She said, I'd like to try. I said, okay. I'll need you to actually try, not just say the word. I noticed the difference. She said, with something that might have been the first real laugh I'd heard from her in years. I believe that about you completely. It has been 6 weeks since the gala. The board recognition and compensation adjustment were finalized 2 weeks ago, retroactive, as requested, to the years the work was actually performed. I am now a voting member of the Castellane Hospitality Group Board. The succession process has been formally reopened, with an external search firm engaged to review both internal and external candidates against a defined set of qualifications. A process I insist include specifically a full and accurate accounting of contributions made by every internal candidate over the preceding 5 years, the kind of accounting that would have caught Baton Rouge the first time if anyone had been looking properly. I have not decided whether I will formally pursue the CEO role myself. I want to be honest about that, because I think the honest answer matters more than a tidy ending. Part of me wants it. The part that has spent 6 years building a precise, accurate map of this company's actual operations in my head, layer by layer, the part that knows, the way Mamie Adeline knew at my age, exactly what is sitting there waiting to be seen by someone willing to look closely enough. Part of me does not want it. The part that has spent 29 years being told that the way my mind works makes certain kinds of leadership impossible for me. A belief I'm still, slowly, in layers, working to fully unlearn. I'm giving myself time to decide, which is something I'm only now learning I'm allowed to do. I have my great-grandmother's portrait in my apartment now. The one that used to hang in the Magazine Street private dining room, the same room where the board voted 7-2 in my favor. I asked the company archivist for it specifically, and Desmond Achebe, who has become something between a trusted advisor and a friend in the 6 weeks since the gala, helped me arrange the transfer. I look at it most evenings. Not because I believe she is watching in any literal sense. I do not generally process the world in terms of metaphysical presence, and I have never pretended otherwise, even to comfort people who might prefer that I did. I look at it because it is a fact, documented and permanent, that a woman who built an empire from $412.50 years of unglamorous work looked at a quiet, 9-year-old girl lining up sugar packets in a restaurant booth and saw with total clarity exactly what was there. Not a complication, not a thing requiring management. A mind built for seeing what other people walk past without noticing. She spent 4 years, before she died, building a structure designed to make sure that fact could not be erased, managed away, or quietly credited to someone else. She built it the way she built everything, methodically in layers, checked for accuracy, designed to hold weight it might not need to bear for years until the exact day it was needed. That is the inheritance that actually matters to me, not the 41%, though I am grateful for it and intend to use it carefully. The other part, the proof, permanent and on the record, that I was seen accurately by someone whose judgment I trust completely, long before I had any way of proving it myself. If you're autistic, or you love someone who is, or you have simply spent your life being the person your family decided needed managing rather than knowing, I want you to hear this clearly. The way your mind works is not a complication to be apologized for. It might be, as my great-grandmother told me at a kitchen table 30 years ago, the rarest gift in the room, simply waiting for someone patient enough to look closely and see it. You do not need a secret trust to prove that, but you deserve people in your life who see it without one. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Tell me if someone in your family has decided what you are instead of asking who you actually are. Tell me if you're still waiting for someone to look closely enough. Share this with someone who has spent their life being managed instead of known. They deserve to be seen exactly as they are. Subscribe if you haven't. Still waters run deep. I will see you in the next one.